You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Hello, I'm Laura Sabatini, Principal Researcher in the Human Capital Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by The Conference Board. Today, I'm here with Dr. Curtis Odom to speak about his latest book, Things I Heard My Professor Say, Insights from My Favorite Business School Class. So a couple of words about the book that we're going to discuss during the podcast. Things My Professor Say is a collection of quotes, experiences, and lessons learned captured by a student taking an organizational behavior class taught by the author. The student, who's also a co-author, Eli Bulus, distilled the different types of insights heard in class, focusing on what really impacted him and ultimately showing that words matter in class as well as in other contexts. So a few words about our guest today, Dr. Curtis Odom. He's an executive professor at Northeastern University, a distinguished principal research fellow at the Conference Board, and is also a senior council member at the Forbes Coaches Council. Curtis is an experienced entrepreneur, business owner, and former Fortune 100 executive who consults coaches and teaches from his experience on getting results. The full bio can be found on the Conference Board website, so I go ahead and introduce our guest. Curtis, welcome to Off the Shelf.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be with you today, Laura.
Thank you. So I like to start by speaking about how the book came about, because that is a great story in and of itself. Can you tell us a little bit about how the book happened and how did you partner with your student, former student, I should say, Eli Bulus?
Sure. Happy to tell you about it. I think the story in and of itself is what I love to tell most often. Eli was an engaged student throughout his time as my student in organizational behavior class in the fall of 2018. He was also a senior who was about to graduate. He didn't have a job lined up, so my course and the things that he heard in class obviously were very timely and relevant for where he was and what he was about to go through in life. And as I talked about in my class, the street name of my course is How to Play the Game, so also known as the real world. All I did was make sure to tell the students at the beginning of the semester that if I say something twice, then it's important. Write it down. Fast forward to the end of the semester, and I received an email from Eli with an attached playbook. So you imagine you're a professor, you've taught, this academic semester, and you get this email, and it says, "Hey, professor, I really enjoyed the class. Thank you so much." And attached to it was this thing he entitled Odom's Playbook. And the email touched me so much. It's included in the book. I put it on page 4 of the book, because it really just shows you, showed me the impact that we can have on people when we show up as our authentic self and we put our passion into things that we do. There's really no idea, there's really no reach to how impactful and influential, your words, thoughts, actions, and behaviors could be. So thinking about this, I had some time over the pandemic, as most of us did, and I was going through my computer, cleaning up files and things, and I stumbled across again what was really the best gift I've ever gotten in my career. So I thought about, how can I get Eli more involved into creation of what became this book? When I sat with it and thought about it, hey, these ideas that we covered in my class that Eli captured, others should have the opportunity to read these things, think about these things, and apply them to their life. So a few ideas came to mind. The name on the cover of the book, that was easy to figure out. Then we started to think about, how do we get the two of us together to maybe do a picture or a photo for the book? Well, COVID made that not so easy to do. What about a forward? I was like, you know what? This guy, without him, this book wouldn't exist. So I reached out to him on LinkedIn, hadn't talked to him in 2 years, and I said, hey, wanted to, again, thank you for the gift that you gave me, but I want to take it that, one step further. I want to honor you by asking you to be my co-author in the book that we're going to write together. And I want you to write the foreword and really add your perspective as a student in my class, and really give his voice to the story. And that's what we did.
Yeah, And you definitely get that from the book. And again, I really appreciated the story behind it. I think contribute to the reading of it. So what was the process? So you mentioned, your students sent you all these insight from your class that I imagine were probably organized based on the class course. This was a class, as I mentioned earlier, on organizational behavior. How did you go about organizing the content and insights? And on that note, is there a way that how can the reader benefit the most from reading this book? Is there a way to read the book? How would you recommend the readers do that?
Yeah, no, oh, thank you for asking that. What I would say, first and foremost, just proof positive that Eli is just such a good student. He sent me this playbook. It was already organized into categories: emotional intelligence, company fit, networking, negotiating, etc. And he took the opportunity just to lay out what hit him in these different sections that were connected to the course. So all I did really was just strip off the categories and allow the reader to really fit them into their own thinking and take my words and move that into, kind of an organized flow. But I don't like to tell you in which section of the course were these things, said out loud, or what were the things that he heard me say. So the second question you asked me, how to read the book. Well, first you have to buy the book. So I think that that's important, right? So first buy the book. Then I would say put yourself in a reflective mindset before you start reading. Admittedly, this is a short book. If you read it, opened it and read it cover to cover, you can get done very quickly. That's not the intent. We want you to make time to read the book, and when you're doing so, look at your career, your life, your career through work, whether it's school, what have you, if you're just getting ready to embark upon that. But take a look at where you are, maybe even look back. Then go through and highlight or mark or, fold down pages that resonate to you, the most. Keep track of what stands out, and how do you feel when you read those different things on the pages. And then we constructed the book, as you see, to have a lot of white space, I should say, before and after the quote. So we want you to write examples on the pages to keep track for yourself. That's, why we put that white space there. Fill it up with your thoughts, ideas, connections, other quotes that really hit you. So the book actually turns into a workbook in its own way. And then we talk about it as a saute and simmer. We read through it, we hit something that's, wow, okay, that's impactful. I need to put this down and think about this and have that, really wash over me. This is a book that you want to revisit over time. Maybe use it to set periodic reminders in your phone to come back and check the book, every month or week or whatever works for you. Maybe even take time, with your manager in meetings to see how you could use it for your professional growth. So I think, the idea is that this book could be a lot of things. It's what you want it to be, but it is not a sit down, read cover to cover, check the box and be done type of book.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. As I was going through, the different quotes and thinking in preparation for this podcast, but I was also thinking, there's so many themes here, and later I'm definitely going to ask you about some specific quotes. But before we get to that, I was wondering. So, in my perspective, as I think about this book and I think about our audience at the conference board, it's really not just about teaching, right? And even it's not even just about organizational behaviors. I think it shows, first of all, that the words we say have an impact. So we may not realize what others are hearing, but we have to pay attention to that. And also that this impact can apply to a lot of different contexts. So this collections was built in a classroom, but I can see how those insights would apply to leadership, to coaching, a lot of different areas where you work. What are your thoughts about that as you think about the book and your process putting it together?
Sure. And thank you for that question. For me, quotes are really important, and they help me frame my thinking all the way through my time being in the military, being in corporate, being a business owner, and certainly being a professor. The one quote that really frames everything for me is a quote that's attributed to Teddy Roosevelt, who is famously, purported to have said, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." I took that to heart when I first heard that quote during my doctoral studies at Pepperdine University, and I bring that thinking into the classroom. From my experience, both as being a student and thinking about my students, they can tell whether you are there for them or there for yourself. When you add that into my feeling about leadership, that leadership is really all about connecting with people, none of us wants to be led by someone we cannot connect with, someone we don't respect, or someone we don't trust. So I share my story through quotes, anecdotes, stories, analogies with my executive coaching clients, and certainly with my students for that reason, so that they may know me as my authentic self and then more easily decide if they can connect with, respect, and trust me.
Those are great insights. And, as someone that does work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's so many elements of inclusive leadership in there. So I'll definitely ask you about that in a second. But first, we're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to continue our conversation with Dr. Curtis Odom on the new book, Things I Heard My Professor Say.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the Conference Board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Hello, and welcome back to our discussion about the book, Things I Heard My Professor Say, Insights from My Favorite Business Class, with Dr. Curtis Odom. Curtis, in the second part of the podcast, I like to highlight some of the specific quotes and the practical insights and recommendations that we just discussed earlier. And I'm thinking, again, our audience can be typically it's people leaders, organizational practitioners. So a lot of the content here applies. You also have great insights for people earlier in their career, maybe. So to start, do you have a favorite quote or recommendation that from the book? I know, tough one, right?
I know that's a tough one. It's like asking which one is your favorite child. All of them, but I think the one that I think of most often and I share with people is the fact that, there are four things that people want from any job. They want to be welcomed, to be valued, to contribute, and to be their authentic self. And you'll find that in the book on page 6. And if I could cheat, I'd say the second favorite that I have, and this is something that has really helped me think about my career, is that influence and inspiration do not require an introduction. And that's on page 54 in the book.
Yeah. No, that's great. Those are great. And I also like those a lot. And so this is a question coming from someone I also teach a class, and I was trying to think, I was reading the book, do I remember how I say things and exactly how I say it? And, sometimes, especially if you teach the same class multiple times, you may not really realize, the exact quotes, right? It's more about the topics. So
Right.
Is there a quote that surprised you when you saw it captured by Eli?
Absolutely. What's so interesting that goes back to the origin of the book is that I didn't know that Eli was doing this. This is me, in a fall semester class, 9:50 class in the morning on Tuesday and Friday. And I'm just trying to bring the content of the course alive with the context of my experience, anecdote stories, as I mentioned earlier. The one quote that really surprised me, I found on page 61, which I should say made it to page 61 of the book, is that positive feedback given at the wrong time can be a negative.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw that quote, first, yes, that's something I definitely did say. But I think about it, the origin of that when I was going through the content and we were talking about, how do people work and connect themselves into a culture? We were talking about the idea of being self-aware.
Yeah.
Because any growth there's that quote, or what people say is that practice makes perfect. And I disagree. I think practice makes permanent. It's practice plus feedback that makes perfect. And when I was sharing with them that, feedback is essential for growth, but if you give somebody the gift of feedback at the wrong time, it's not really a gift. It's a slight, and it's something that someone may not be in a place or space or time that they could really appreciate.
Yeah.
So that gift becomes lost. And I was
Yeah.
trying to get across to the students and obviously to Eli that, just because you have the best intentions of giving someone feedback that is a positive thing, think about the person, where they are, and if they're ready to receive that feedback before you give them that gift.
Yeah. No, that was, as you're mentioning, that was also a great insight for me. And yeah, so, a lot of the information, as we mentioned earlier, can apply, in different ways. Some can be to individual leaders. Some it's really a lot of quotes about also work cultures and organizations, both from a perspective of a leader communicating about the culture, but also of an employee or a person that is about to join an organization, for example. What do you look for? So I found that especially helpful. So given that, earlier you spoke about how you recommend for the reader to explore the book and sort of highlight what is most relevant to them and their work. And so I figured, I brought some themes that were kind of meaningful to me. And also, so I have a few quotes also of reference, but I actually thought about the working themes. So as we said, everybody will make this unique and maybe think about it in different ways, but things that are especially relevant, again, in the work that I do related to inclusion and inclusive leadership. So the first set of themes that stood out to me was about work cultures and organizations, and some are so relevant now. And I know, this class was before the pandemic, but there's quotes around flexibility, sustainability, resilience, and how ability to change is really a key element of making a workplace sustainable, right?
Yes.
And so definitely wanted to hear what you thought about that. And I see a quote, and I'm sorry I wasn't as diligent as you to write down the page number, but there's a really interesting quote about the company's ability or to change, or also resistant to change, having to do with also to some extent to how well they're doing. So
yes.
So these are the themes that stood out to me. I just wanted you to see if there's any commentary or anything that you wanted to discuss related to this first theme around flexibility, sustainability, and resilience.
Sure. One of the things that I talk about often in class to the students who may have not heard this before is the idea that, organizations change for one of two reasons, either because they want to or they have to. And coupled with that is the idea that the more successful or the longer that an organization is successful, the more resistant to change they will be. And you think about colleges and universities. Many of them have been around for hundreds of years, and they must be doing something right because they're still here. So the idea that a college or a university or an iconically branded organization would just all of a sudden decide to change, that's really rare. And I talk about the idea that some external supply or demand pressure has to be levied against an organization to get it to either feel like it has to change or for the leaders to want to change. Well, hello, COVID-19, hello, global pandemic. All of us as leaders are taught to be strategic and, to try to see around corners, if you will. But no one, no matter how strategic they would think themselves to be, no one planned for what happens when the world shuts down. So when you think about the lessons that came out of this and are still coming out of the pandemic as we start to return to, the workplace, I mean, certainly we've all been working, but we return to the idea of a traditional workplace. And we start thinking about teams and groups and people working together. The idea of flexibility has a whole new definition now based upon the pandemic. There were organizations that never believed that they could do the work that needed to be done in a virtual environment or a hybrid environment. The pandemic has proved that wrong and actually shown in certain instances, research is pointing to, organizations and people have been more productive in the pandemic rather than less. Sustainability, thinking about the fact there are fewer people on the road, there are fewer people in the air, there are fewer people leaving the heavy footprint on Mother Earth. And that sustainability has carried on. I mean, do we really need to be one person or two people to a car to get to a place to do work that we obviously can do virtually or remotely? And then certainly the idea of resilience. The pandemic caused us all to go through three phases, and we're still going through them, which was first to react to the pandemic, then to adapt to life during the pandemic. And now coming out of it, how do we transform, or how are we transforming as a result of the lessons that we learned during this, interesting and very tumultuous time
Yeah,
for everybody and any aspect of any organization, regardless of where they might lead from. So it's all
definitely.
of those things. It's kind of interesting. They were in the book before we ever really needed it to be there. So I'm curious, down the road to hear what readers think about the applicability of those pre-pandemic espoused thoughts and quotes to this post-pandemic way of living and working.
I agree, and those insights can be so helpful. And also, now you have a real example of what happens if you're not resilient or if you're not open to change. And also curious to see going back, sort of to see what organizations do and if they take those lessons. Sometimes I'm surprised to hear from leaders that think things are going to go back exactly the way they were before. And of course, well, we'll see.
Yeah.
So this
I'm one that doesn't believe so. I mean,
exactly.
something
Exactly.
I said to someone is the fact of if you think about when 9/11 happened, that
Hmm.
was a terrible day in just here in the United States, certainly terrible the way that everybody felt and reacted to it across the world. But if one terrible day could change the way that we have traveled for
Yeah,
now 20 years, think about how one terrible year is going to impact the way that we work and live, possibly forever.
exactly. Yes, yes, completely agree. So the second theme, again, from my perspective, I'm thinking about inclusion, but this is much broader than that. It's about building leadership skills and also looking at leaders and their work. And so one quote that stood up also because of where we are right now, it's about dealing with adversity. And I think that that's also related to what you were talking about when it comes to flexibility, sustainability. And so, but I love the quote where you say that the true character often comes up during moments of adversity, related to leadership in that case.
Yes.
And so just wanted to hear, I don't know if you remember the context of that quote, but
Yeah,
that's a theme that stood out to me.
certainly. One of the things that I talk about, one of the many that I talk about in this course when we get to the idea of leadership is that, and I say this to the students very plainly. Again, the street name for my course is How to Play the Game. Also,
Mhm.
some of the students call it Keeping It Real. But, I say to them that there are many people out here in leadership roles who do not have leadership skills. And if they have leadership skills, they don't know how to demonstrate them.
Yep.
And what really has been the litmus test for me is the fact of there's no greater test of someone's ability to lead than at a time of adversity. And that goes all the way back to my 10 years serving in the United States Navy, is that some of the best leaders that I had the opportunity to work with and serve with were leaders who, when it all went down, they had a way about them. That's not to say that they were stoic or they didn't react or they were emotionless, but they had a plan. They were seen as unflappable. They knew that, okay, we're all in this together. Let's figure out what we can do. Let's figure out how we're going to move forward. Let's make sure that we're all on the same page, that we can agree with what we're going to do, and let's make it happen. You know, in that space, I've brought that certainly into out of the military, into the civilian world, and into the life that I've had now 20 years post United States Navy. And I think about that idea of leaders. Now, the best leaders that I've seen, worked with, worked for, consulted with, coached, what have you, when the adversity hits, they don't fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to the resilience. It's not to
Yep.
say they didn't get caught off guard, but it's also one of those things where if you think about Mike Tyson, he's famous for the quote. Again, quotes are important to me. Mike Tyson's quote is, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And the idea is that the pandemic punched a lot of people in the
Mm-hmm.
mouth. And there are a lot of things that happen every day where you might have had a plan, but do you have a plan for when that plan doesn't work?
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that the best leaders that I have had the opportunity to see, they never seem to be caught without an idea of what to do or how to
Yeah.
do it.
Definitely. And also, I mean, implied in that quote is about how you treat others, right? So
Yes.
even in moments of crisis, how do you stand by your people, by your team, and support them? And I think that, again, the pandemic really emerges in probably a time where those quotes are especially relevant.
Absolutely.
So the last area, so we talked about organizational culture, individual leadership. I also enjoyed, and I think it's very important, all the insights around building your career, navigating organizational cultures. You mentioned your course was also called How to Play a Game. And a few years ago, I did a study related to navigating the rules in organizations. And so I see a lot of very aligned ideas there. And so, but the one thing that really stood out related to building your career has to do with quotes around opportunities for growth. So considering your work and what you're contributing to the organization, but also what you're learning and in the day-to-day work, for example, which is, of course, a privilege to continue to learn. But I think it's an important for any student and joining the workforce to think about. So I wanted to start with that theme, how do you continue to get opportunities for growth at work?
Sure. There's a movie that many will know. It's called The Pursuit of Happiness, and
Yep.
it stars Will Smith, and he is portraying Chris Gardner, a fascinating individual. I had a chance to meet Chris Gardner
Oh, that's
in
great.
passing in my career. And in the movie, there's a scene that really stuck out to me, and I share this with my students, and just kind of paraphrasing. In the movie, Will Smith and the character of Chris Gardner is walking by, what seems to be like in the business district, maybe the stock exchange, what have you, and he sees this gentleman pull up in this bright red sports car. And Will Smith, as Chris Gardner, approaches this guy, seeing the sports car, seeing this guy who obviously is a picture of wealth and happiness and everything that, the whole idea of what people would want, motivations, if you talk about extrinsic motivation. And in the movie, Chris Gardner says to the man, he goes, "Listen, I just have two questions for you. What do you do and how do you do it?" And when I saw that in the movie, it really hit me from the standpoint that everything that I've wanted to do and I help my students see that they may want to do comes from those two questions. I've been fortunate enough in my career that when I see somebody doing something that I want to do or think that I want to do, I've had the courage to ask them to first introduce myself, of course, but then to say, "Hey, you know what? I am really interested in what do you do and how do you do it?" What I have found, much like in the movie, people who are at a place that they are passionate about, they're contributing, they're self actualized, if you want to go to the top of Maslow's hierarchy, if they're fully in their space, they have no problem telling you what they do and how they do it. They're not going to tell you what to do. They'll just tell you their story. And if you listen intently and you're savvy enough, you can take direction from that. Or if nothing else, check in and say, you know what, do I really want to do that or do I not?
Yeah.
So I give that to my students and I say, that's your first opportunity for growth.
Yep.
And then second is to always be adjusting your mindset, your skill set, and your tool set.
Yep.
To not be complacent. I mean, mindset, you can go back to the famous book by Carol Dweck and thinking about the idea of growth mindset.
Yep.
Certainly there's that. But what about your skill set? Are you always updating your skill set? Are there new things that you know how to do? Are you sharpening the saw that they talk about, that Peter Covey talks about? Are you doing that? But then your tool set, what do you bring to the table?
Yep.
Every leader out there is looking for people who can come to the table with a mindset, a skill set, and a tool set that matches not only where the organization is going, but what the organization needs in that moment. So when I say that to my students, I get them to realize that they always have to be assessing, evaluating, and contributing to their growth rather than waiting for someone to show up and hand growth to them.
And just communicating that, I think, is so important. And I was thinking about it both in terms of, again, you communicating to the students, but also leaders setting that expectations up front, because not everyone may come with that knowledge that that's something they have to do. So it's a great coaching also quote or kind of theme in my perspective.
Sure. And I have to apologize. I said Peter Covey. It's really Stephen Covey. I don't know how I forgot that. Maybe I was too excited in giving you the answer. but it is definitely Stephen Covey.
Okay, and I didn't notice, so it's all good.
Well, that's good.
Exactly. So, coaches, unfortunately, we are at the end of this podcast. Really great insights. I hope it'll encourage people to go and get the book. And at the end of this podcast, this is a podcast about books. So we always like to ask our guests for any suggestions I have about readings and books that had impacted you or influenced you or related to the topic that we discussed today, probably. But if you have any others, also feel free to share.
Sure. Yeah, there are two books that I'm really, really fond of, and I refer to and I direct others toward. The first is a book called The One Thing: The Surprisingly Simple Truth Behind Extraordinary Results. It's a great book by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. And in that book, you'll learn how to cut through the clutter, achieve better results in less time, and build momentum toward your goals. So I think it's a fascinating book. I read it often. My copy is completely dog-eared and highlighted. Great book. The second one is a book that I found not too long ago, and it's called Trillion Dollar Coach: The Leadership Playbook of Silicon Valley's Bill Campbell. And this book is written by Eric Schmidt, Jonathan Rosenberg, and Alan Eagle. And in this book, the three authors honor the man they fondly know and have known as Coach Bill after his departure, after he has passed. And the inspiration is to teach future generations how their mentor, Bill, built trusting relationships, fostered personal growth, inspired courage, and helped them figure out things in a very fast-moving environment that was Silicon Valley. So those are two books that I would recommend. Check them out. They're really full of gold nuggets, like I hope people will feel about things I heard my professor say.
Thank you. Great recommendations. And thank you for speaking with us today. I will also thank our listeners for tuning into this conversation. You can purchase the book, Things I Heard My Professor Say, Insights from My Favorite Business School Class, at any bookstore or online. And there's actually a website for more information. You can visit Things I Heard My Professor Say. It's a oneword.com. Again, it's Things I Heard My Professor Say, oneword.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion series, or you can explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board. This is available on our website at conference/board.org/podcasts. This is Laura Sabattini from the Conference Board, and thank you for joining us today.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.